Hello everyone and welcome back into yet another episode here of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name, as your host, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this wonderful Friday afternoon. Hope all is well. But we have a great show ahead of us today, starting off by previewing the second of two CFP semifinals. Last night's game was a thrilling finish. Congratulations to Notre Dame. Now we focus on Ohio State and Texas, and hopefully that game will be as good as last night's. Going to be talking about NFL Wildcard Weekend, previewing some of the final games we haven't gotten to already on the show, but also squeezing in there another one of these teams who has a good shot at winning the Super Bowl this season amongst the AFC's elite, the Baltimore Ravens. We'll be talking about the reasons why I think that could potentially happen for Baltimore. But before we get into any of that good stuff, it's going to be great. I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network to keep up to date with all the content we release on the show. If you want to do it a little bit more directly, contribute and interact, get your opinions out there more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions on areas. You can do the same through our website, gsmcpodcast.net as well. You can leave a tip or donation or any questions, comments, or concerns there as well. But if you want to do it while we are streaming our show, the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features are the best way to go. Just make this show that much better. Everyone else around the network really appreciates it as just as much as me, I can tell you that. Without further ado, let's jump right into discussions of the second CFP semifinal, Ohio State-Texas. Now, let me set the scene here, and I promise, coming into this, bear in mind that I am a Texas Longhorns fan, so there is going to be a little bit of bias here, potentially a little bit of favoritism. I'm going to try and be as bipartisan as possible in this one. But let me set the scene before anything else. Notre Dame Penn State has already been somewhat of an illustrious quote-unquote rivalry amongst the two blue bloods there in college football. But you would think Ohio State-Texas would be similar. It actually is not. These teams have only played 3 times in their history, but in all 3 of those moments, they were win and in for national championship situations. The last one being, if anyone can remember, that 2009 season, the Colt McCoy era in Texas, the last time, quote-unquote, Texas were back. Colt McCoy, in the final seconds of that game, finds Quan Cosby, sends his team to the championship game, but we all know what happened after that. He gets injured, and who knows if he had stayed in that game, if they would have won that game ultimately against Alabama, but it's only hypotheticals at this point. Now, the rivalry, quote-unquote rivalry, as like I said, only 3 games have been played between these teams in their history, is renewed. And tonight's game really represents the face of the new era of college football, because both of these teams were kind of been constructed not just through transfer portals, but through players who have invested into the culture of college football. On the Ohio State side of things, this is a roster that is the most talented and most expensive in all of college football. A lot of transfers, still a lot of young men wanting to stay within this program as well to try and make a run in the national championship. Same thing for Texas. And funnily enough, Quinn Ewers does face his former team in this matchup, and he is seen as kind of the new face of the NIL era of college football. Remember, he was the number 1 overall recruit in 2021, signed with Ohio State, then reclassified, transferred to Texas, and now here he is facing his quote-unquote former team. But ultimately, this game resembles a chance for both teams to start anew. For Ohio State, yes, they were the first ever winners of the college football playoff, and Texas really wants to get back to that early 2000s mystique, finally saying and proclaiming that they are back. But no matter what, this is going to be an absolutely high-octane affair between these two teams. But before we get into my predictions, ultimately, let's look at how these two teams will game plan for this and ultimately the keys to victory for both of them. For Ohio State, Coming into the CFP, they were coming off perhaps one of the most baffling losses to arch rivals Michigan in recent memory. Yes, they haven't beaten Michigan in quite some time, but this one proved to be the most weird and bizarre. They lost 13-10 with a lot more talent without Michigan's top two defensive players, really. And coming into the college football playoff, a lot of people were saying that they potentially be upset at home by Tennessee, and if they should have made it past Tennessee, which they did, they would ultimately fall to Oregon. But no, they've clearly looked like the best team in the postseason. It's come down to Will Howard's play, but also the versatility and multifaceted nature of their wide receiver core. So, the Ohio State key to victory is quite simple here. Feed the best of those receivers. Okay, my graphic. Jeremiah Smith. Jeremiah Smith is a truly special player. Remember, he is just a freshman, but he has proven to be semi-alien in some of his performances against elite competition, especially against Oregon. Coming into that game, yes, they were the favorites after their beatdown of Tennessee, but still a lot of people may be down them because Oregon was the number one team in the country, had already beaten them before. But ultimately, Jeremiah Smith really took over that game to the tune of 187 yards, 2 touchdowns, and this is going to be a tough task. But I do feel like the reason why in that best against best match between Texas secondary and Ohio State receiver, the versatility of not just Jeremiah Smith, but the other receivers in this core will allow him to line up basically anywhere and really challenge and move around a lot of these corners and safeties for Texas. And I do think that a lot of movement and motion amongst this Ohio State offense is paramount because Texas is one of the most disciplined defenses they will face all year. And so you have to kind of disguise things, move things around, keep them on their toes, and Jeremiah Smith is a big part of that. And I also think, most importantly, you have to get the ball away quickly because Texas's pass rush is also going to be a factor. And I'm going to talk about that as well in terms of Texas keys to victory. But ultimately, I do think the best aspects of this Ohio State offense are predicated on getting the ball into Jeremiah Smith's hands, especially in space and downfield, and really testing this Texas secondary. Also, make it so that it's not always barren against Smith. Make it so that he's lined up against Jilbo or Muhammad. Attack some of the weaker guys in that Texas secondary. Make it so that Barron really has to communicate a lot more than he's usually attuned to really kind of baffle this Texas secondary in ways they may not have seen before. So ultimately, while there are a lot of ways that Ohio State can attack this Texas defense, I feel like Jeremiah Smith is going to have to be the guy. And if he is the guy, it opens up a lot for Emeka Ibuka. It opens up a lot for Carnell Tate. It opens up a lot for Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson in the ground game. And most importantly, it keeps Will Howard upright, which leads me into Texas's keys to victory, knowing Will Howard from their time in the Big 12 and for Will Howard's time at Kansas State respectively, getting consistent pressure on him. Because as good as Will Howard has looked in this college football playoff, the best quarterback by a country mile thus far in the college football playoff, and the QBR stats don't lie. He is seen as the weak link of this Ohio State offense because he is prone to make mistakes, and when he's pressured, he does get a little bit timid outside of structure. So, while I do think that the Ohio State receivers against the Texas secondary matchup is going to be where the game could be ultimately won or lost, it's the big boys up front for Texas who have to dominate in the trenches. And I'm going to talk about the O-line a little bit, talk about both these offenses as well, but ultimately the Texas big boys on the defensive side of the football have to step up, set the edge, kind of get through in the interior so that either Judkins or Henderson doesn't break out, and ultimately create a muddy pocket for Will Howard to operate in. Because if Will Howard is given all the time in the world behind that offensive line, he's going to pick you apart no matter what your secondary is doing. So, you got to make sure that Will Howard has limited time to throw, and remember, what you did against him against Kansas State, because in that Kansas State game last year, it came down to a critical moment in overtime on 4th down, and Will Howard was pressured and ultimately could not get off the throw in time. And so you have to remember that if you pressure Will Howard, chances are you make him more and more uncomfortable, and thus that's one of the ways you can really help your secondary in terms of covering these receivers, because these receivers can get open easily if given time. In return, Will Howard is given time as well. So that's one of the major factors Texas has to do. Has to be sure of doing in order to try and make a go of it on the defensive side of the football. In terms of these offenses, I do think that Cameron Williams' health is big for the Texas O-line, and I do think it will help the ground game and ultimately keeping Quinn Ewers in rhythm should you decide to come out a little bit more pass-heavy, seeing as to how your run game looked a bit shaky against Arizona State last week. I do think keeping him in rhythm, giving him some quick throws early in the game and sustaining drives is going to be paramount. And then on the Ohio State side of things, just rely on your college football playoff game plan. Don't revert back to the team who was vulnerable against the Nebraskas and Michigans of the world. You gotta continue playing this high-octane style of offense and make Texas adjust to you and react to you rather than you having to react to what Texas adjusts to. So that's a big part of it, and ultimately I think it's going to be an exciting game, but in terms of predictions, I'm going to have to pull a Lee Corso. Like I said, I'm a lifelong Texas fan. Seeing as last time Texas won in a win-in into the national championship game, that's a big factor as well. And also, if Texas does win, it'll be kind of fulfilling the prophecy going up against Notre Dame. The first time the phrase Texas is back was coined. Remember that game, Tyrone Swoops diving into the end zone to score and proclaim Texas is back. So a lot of voodoo magic could potentially happen, but it's Ohio State in terms of on paper and what I think will transpire on the field. They're just too talented. They're the best offense this Texas defense has faced, but anything can happen. Like I said, Texas is more familiar with Will Howard than anyone else in the field, and so that could be a huge factor into this, but I think Ohio State's going to win this one. I think it's going to be closer than a lot of people think. I'm going to say it's 31-27 as the final, but ultimately Ohio State is just too talented a roster, too talented a team to lose to Texas at this juncture of the season. But no matter what, my heart will be pounding throughout this game, whether it's a blowout or whether it's close at the end. Just know that. But let me know what you think about this game in the comments, because coming up next, we're going to be talking about why another one of the AFC's elite has a chance to hoist the Lombardi yet again, the Baltimore Ravens. We'll be right back out of this short break to talk about them as well.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again, if you want to keep updated with this show and all the other shows around the network, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both my show, other shows in the network as a whole. That is greatly appreciated by all. But if you want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly throughout its duration, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great ways always to get your opinions on air. You can do the same through our website, gsmcpodcast.net, and it's also a good way to leave a tip or donation if you do feel so inclined. Anything you do through these features makes the show that much better, and it is genuinely appreciated by all concerned here at the network. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of the day, talking about how and why I believe the Ravens can win the Super Bowl. We talked about the Chiefs and Bills yesterday, and I wanted to highlight the Baltimore Ravens as well because they're amongst the big three of the AFC's elite. We can't deny that. Lamar Jackson is potentially going to win his third MVP award this season. But there's a reason as to why the Baltimore Ravens haven't won before, and it's because of that very same man, Lamar Jackson. But if there's a year where Baltimore can finally break through, why not this one? Because I do think there's more balance to the squad than there was last year, and the defense, which was a concern towards the middle of the season, has improved down the stretch as well, allowing some of the fewest points in the entire league. So there are reasons to believe that if you're a Baltimore Ravens fan or someone who's been following the Ravens all season, that they can really hoist the Lombardi yet again. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into the many ways that I think the Ravens do have a good shot at this thing. Let's start off with talking about the form that they're in. We talked about how the defense has kind of fallen off compared to last year under Mike McDonald's reign. They lost a couple of pieces, Patrick Queen being a huge reason as to why this defense early on declined steadily. But right now, heading into the postseason, they've looked better than ever. They've allowed, I believe, only 11.4 points over these last 4 games. It's really shown how this Baltimore Ravens defense can attack you. And it all starts in the secondary. When last year it started up front, now these guys in the back end are really holding up in coverage. And it's a big reason as to why I think a lot of these opposing passing attacks have to account for that. Guys on the outside like Marlon Humphrey and Nate Wiggins are true lockdown corners, and it really forces teams to focus on the middle of the field where you're more prone to turnovers if you're an offense. And so I think that's a major reason as to why I think this Ravens defense can be special down the stretch in the postseason. And then on the offensive side of things, there's more balance to this attack than there was last year, where Lamar really had to do a lot more than he's doing this year. Obviously, he's still performing at a high level, still performing at an MVP caliber level, but he also now has Derrick Henry in the backfield to balance everything out. But a huge reason as to why their Super Bowl candidacy might have taken a hit is paramount to not just what I think of them throughout all the games they might have to play in order to get to the Super Bowl, but this specific game against the Steelers. Zay Flowers is out because of that knee injury sustained about 2 weeks ago, so that's going to be an unfortunate loss for them. But in terms of why I think now is different, I just think that Lamar is trusting a lot of these guys a lot more than he did last year. Remember, Zay Flowers was a rookie last year, and he made a lot of rookie mistakes that cost them, especially in that AFC Championship game, especially in last year's postseason. But now, even that he's out and hopefully he will come back, he started to trust a lot of guys in the system. For example, Rashad Bateman has really shown himself as a vertical threat downfield. He still trusts Mark Andrews, who is as reliable as any tight end in the NFL right now. Isaiah Likely as well, another one of these big physical tight ends he's really grown to trust. And so we see a lot more versatility in this offense as well. And let me remind you of Justice Hill as well. It's not just Derrick Henry you have to worry about, whose physical style of running the football wears defensive down. You have to worry about this kind of scat back in Justice Hill, who's brilliant receiving the football out of the backfield. He's one of the best receiving backs, in my opinion, in the entire NFL. And that just makes this Ravens attack that much more dangerous and fearsome headed into this postseason compared to last year's. And yes, we have to talk about, if we talk about the Ravens in the postseason, Lamar Jackson's record. And especially against the Steelers team, who, while they haven't played each other in the playoffs in the Lamar Jackson era, have had their number in the Lamar Jackson era and in the playoffs as well. And so that has to be planted in a lot of people's minds right now, right? The fact that, yes, this Ravens offense looks much different from last year. There are more ways that they can control the game, more ways that Lamar Jackson feels confident in the downfield passing game, but you still have to remember this bad record in the postseason. And ultimately, if the Baltimore Ravens do end up losing before the Super Bowl or in the Super Bowl, I just think that a stigma surrounding Lamar Jackson will only grow. And I think that even if he wins the MVP award, nothing is more justified than winning the Super Bowl if you are a two-time MVP, because every single two-time MVP up to this point, outside of Lamar Jackson, has won a Super Bowl. So that stigma is only going to continue to grow if he can't get it done this year. But we have to remember that in the AFC, I do feel a lot of these teams, while are heavily reliant on their defenses, don't necessarily like the style of football that the Ravens play. What I mean by this is, I do feel like the fact that Lamar Jackson's a dual threat running quarterback, and that Derrick Henry is so powerful in his style of running, that I feel like these AFC teams who are more focused, I guess, on turning the ball over rather than, actually trying to stop the run or certain aspects of what Baltimore does, really plays into the hands of what Baltimore can do. And yes, Zay Flowers against this Pittsburgh defense that, yes, has looked sloppy over the past couple of weeks, but still a very, very aggressive, passionate defense in its own right, is a huge loss. And it will factor into how I think about this game from now until tomorrow night. But I do think that there are more ways to compensate for these injuries, for these pratfalls in their offense once they arrive, that the Baltimore Ravens can produce. And so that's why I feel like, in terms of any opposing defenses the Ravens might have to face on their path to the Super Bowl, I'm not necessarily too concerned about their point production. And then on the defensive side of things, going back to them, I do think that those cover corners really create a conundrum for a lot of these quarterbacks. A lot of these quarterbacks that they're going to have to face, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, are very disciplined in taking what you give them. But I do think that they always have to think about guys like Marlon Humphrey and Nate Wiggins in the back end, in the back of their minds, in terms of how they attack, because Marlon Humphrey and Nate Wiggins have been remarkable down the stretch of the season. And so, with those two cover corners and this pass rush that's also been getting home, I do think Baltimore has the steady improvements on hand needed for this deep run through the postseason. And so, even though they don't have a lot of pieces from last year on the defense side of the football, they don't even have their defensive coordinator from last year, Mike McDonald, they still can find ways to really stifle a lot of these powerful AFC quarterbacks on their side of the bracket. And then let's talk about if they get to the Super Bowl, hypothetically. All of the guys in the NFC, I actually think, are being underestimated in terms of their abilities, especially guys like Stafford, guys like Mayfield, guys like Daniels, to really stress his defense. But I just think that any game the Ravens are in, whether it be against some of those guys or against the heavy favorites like the Lions and the Eagles, I just feel like they're prepared for any kind of game the Lions or Eagles might throw at them. I think that if it were the Eagles they face in the Super Bowl, that they match up pretty well, both offensively and defensively. And I think that Lamar's versatility and Derrick Henry's power really stifles a Philly defense that takes a lot away. And I think that Philly will become a little bit too over-aggressive. And if that game turned into a rock fight, then I could really see the Baltimore Ravens grounding it out through retaining the football through Derrick Henry. And then, if it's the Lions you face, that one seemingly will be a little bit more high-scoring. And so, in turn, I feel like Lamar Jackson and this passing attack can really match up very well with this decimated Lions defense. And defensively, I feel like Jared Goff, yes, has protected the football better than anyone on the NFC side of the bracket, but still is prone to some bad decisions that could swing a football game in an opponent's favor. So Baltimore will be really looking to that. But ultimately, all of these are hypotheticals. What I'm trying to say here is that the Baltimore Ravens are not like last year's team. And that makes a huge difference as to why this could be a will in terms of winning the Super Bowl. But ultimately, I feel like the best aspect of this Ravens team is that no matter what, they can play any kind of football game. They can get dragged through the mud by a physical defense and come out on the other side victorious, or they can put up many points, give up a lot of points, and ultimately come out on top in that regard as well. And I feel like, all the questions that we have about this Ravens offense, will they stagnate at some point like they've done against far less or inferior opponents? Will they really be able to match up with the Chiefs defensively or the Bills defensively come the championship game time? And other questions of that concern. But ultimately, I think that right now, there's no team in the NFL playing like the Baltimore Ravens, both offensively and defensively, with what you have to be concerned about if you're an opposing offense or defense. So that's why I think the many multifaceted aspects of this Ravens team make them as dangerous as anyone on either side of the bracket. And I really do think that they can make a run at it this year. Yes, they're going to be tested against the Steelers yet again. Yes, you can't overlook Lamar's record in the postseason. But I do think this team is rounding into form at the exact right time. And yes, hopefully they get Zay Flowers back in and will make a big difference. But I do think that no matter what, this team is well equipped to handle anything and any adversity in its path. So that is why I believe the Baltimore Ravens can and probably will win this year's Super Bowl. But let me know what you think about them in the comments below, because coming up next, we are continuing looking at NFL's Wildcard weekend, starting off with the 7-2 matchup in the AFC. Potential opponent for the Ravens in the next round, the Broncos and the Bills. Should be an interesting, intriguing matchup there. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of the day, we're going to start talking about some of these NFL wildcard weekend matchups here, starting off in the AFC, concluding with the Broncos-Bills matchup, the 7-2 matchup. It seemingly sounds like a better matchup on paper than I think it will end up being on the field, but I still give the Denver Broncos a lot of credit. I don't necessarily think this will be as big a blowout as people might think, but ultimately, without further ado, let me get into my ultimate thoughts on this specific game. Wrong graphic there. But ultimately, these two teams, I feel like, match up better than people even realize, and I really think that this Broncos defense can prove to be a challenge for this Bills offense. And I feel like, if the Broncos force an early turnover and get good field position through that and keep Bo Nix on schedule, I feel like there could be a path to making this game closer. I don't necessarily think it will be a winning formula on the day, because I just think the Bills are that much better and a little bit more talented at this point in their championship caliber and candidacy. But I do think that this game could be a lot closer than people might realize. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. But talking about this Broncos team in terms of the matchup, I really think that Sean Payton does an excellent job with Bo Nix, his development, And Vance Joseph is an excellent job in getting this quote-unquote no-name defense really disciplined and aggressive. I like what they're doing in terms of allowing Pat Surtain and these corners the opportunity to go mano-a-mano with a team's best receiver and locking them down. And then up front with the linebackers, Cody Barton, mind you, Zach Allen up front, a lot of these guys generating just enough pressure to really annoy opposing quarterbacks. But the Bills' offense offers them their most interesting conundrum because they don't really have a number one wide receiver. And that plays into the hands of someone like Josh Allen, who this year especially has protected the football better than anyone in the NFL. And I do think that plays into him taking what the Broncos give him. I do think that ultimately it's going to be a bit more challenging than he might even realize to be able to get his receivers on schedule and in rhythm. But I do think that that is an interesting thing to realize in the back of a guy like Pat Surtain's mind, is that, okay, this receiving core isn't necessarily just one guy who we have to try and contain. It's guys who can get open for Josh Allen whenever we need them to. And most importantly, Josh Allen can also take off and run the football. So it's not like you can key in on your man one-on-one. You're going to have to really try and determine who to pick up at what time. And so that's why I think this is an interesting offense versus defense matchup here. That's the big question for this Broncos defense heading into this game. Can they slow down Josh Allen and allow these aggressive corners to potentially force turnovers, potentially get good field position, and ultimately allow Bo Nix to grow into this game? Because I do think we turn to the Broncos offense that there are ways that Bo Nix can stay on schedule, because I'm going to talk about one of the reasons why the Bills' defense might falter, but ultimately let's focus on Bo Nix and the Broncos' offense and how they operate. The Bills are a very zone-heavy defensive team, and so you can exploit a lot of things down low in terms of the looks you might be able to get for Bo Nix. But whether or not he's willing to take those looks is what could determine how many points the Broncos can score. Because Bo Nix has been prone to looking deeper than you would like a rookie quarterback to look downfield. And so that has led to some overthrows and mistakes and some interceptions that you can't really happen against this prolific Bills offense. And so if Bo Nix is able to take everything that's underneath and slowly move the footballs, keep on schedule, get to second and shorts, third and short situations so you're not backed up against the sticks all the time, then you can develop a rhythm, you can control the ball a little bit more, and ultimately really strike fear into Bills fans' hearts. And so that's what I want to see from the Broncos offense, if Bo Nix can really take what's underneath rather than go for the big plays. And I think the best way to do it is ironically through their best big play threat, Marvin Mims, because he is very versatile for them. He can go on jet sweeps, he loves bubble and tunnel screens, and he's not just someone who can extend the field vertically. He can stretch you horizontally as well. So this guy is going to be a very versatile gadget piece, an X factor in this matchup offensively for the Broncos that I really, really think can make a difference for how long they can sustain drives. Because I do think that you're going to want to be aggressive a little bit in the passing game to try and keep up with Josh Allen, but it's how you do it and the intentionality you do it with that will ultimately matter for Denver and Bo Nix. But on the Bills side of things, defensively, because we know what this offense is certainly capable of. Defensively, one of the biggest concerns for the Bills is just getting off the field. They're one of the worst defenses in the entire NFL in terms of getting off the field on third down. And I do think that if I look at the stats correctly, the Denver Broncos are one of the better offenses in terms of extending drives. And I do think Bo Nix is certainly capable of making big plays even in third and long situations, because he's someone who, I do think does appreciate the mundanities of just dumping the football off. B, he's a dual threat ability guy. And C, he does trust a lot of his receivers downfield, unlike any other rookie quarterback in the NFL, outside of potentially Jaden Daniels, we'll talk about a bit later. But ultimately, I do think that the Bills' defense really is going to have to stay disciplined in their zone scheme, really try and make it as effective as possible, close and shrink the middle of the field, most importantly, because that's where Bo Nix could be able to be forced to throw the football if you lock down your outside guys in the perimeter. And so that's what I think the Bills need to do defensively. But ultimately, the Broncos have to have in mind, hey, if the Bills are a bad team in terms of forcing 3 and outs, we have a chance to sustain drives. So if you can just get into third and short, potentially say third and 8 to 9 situations, then you might have a shot here, because no matter the length, that's been the Bills' problem all year long, getting off the field. And so that's the thing that can win this football game for the Broncos and really spring an upset that shocks the world. Ball control. It's the nature of what you have to do in the NFL sometimes, especially if you're an underdog like the Broncos. Then, in terms of both of these offenses and how this game could look, I do think that it could become high scoring if both of these defenses win the day. And I do think that ultimately the defenses are what going to determine this game, whether or not the Broncos defense can force a turnover and whether or not the Bills defense will get out the field. But I do have to give respect to both of these offensive schemes, first and foremost. In terms of Sean Payton, for getting Bo Nix to mature throughout the season, developing him into a competent, potentially long-term NFL starter for Denver. And then on the other side of things, Joe Brady really making Josh Allen someone who is worthy of not just the MVP candidacy, but worthy of consideration as someone who could usurp Mahomes as the next face of the NFL, quote-unquote. It's going to take a lot of Super Bowls, but ultimately he can do it. And it's the same reason as to why Mahomes has been so prolific throughout his career. It's because he doesn't turn the ball over, and he takes what the defense gives him. And that's what makes this Bills offense a lot more special than last year's. And so that's why I think that when we look at the ways the Broncos can win, they really start to shrink, because this is a different Josh Allen. He's not someone who you know is going to throw the football downfield. He's not someone who you know has that number one receiver in the back of his mind who, when he gets to a certain part of the field, he's immediately targeting. So that's what makes this challenge, because the Broncos do have ways they can win defensively. They do have the corners and safeties to really challenge this really ragtag receiving core. But ultimately, I do feel that Josh Allen, and especially a player we haven't talked about, James Cook, have been so disciplined in terms of staying on schedule no matter what, extending drives no matter what, that I don't necessarily think it will come down to explosive plays. It will come down to what Josh Allen has done best, protecting the football for the Bills side of things. We talked about Denver trying to control the football, but ultimately the Bills just have to continue doing what they're doing in terms of not turning the football over and sustaining drives and allowing Josh Allen to do his thing. That I think that it will become a little bit too much for this Broncos team to overcome. In terms of my predictions, I do think the Broncos will keep this close for a little bit. I do think that if you get the ball first, you're going to want to establish what you're going to do offensively, show some looks like screens, show Buffalo some looks like, maybe some deep shots, but ultimately make sure that Bo Nix is prepared as soon as he gets on that football field for whatever the Bills show him in coverage. And then ultimately I think that formula will peter out by the mid-second quarter, maybe into the third. But ultimately I just think that as Buffalo grows into the game, this crowd gets behind them. We haven't even talked about the home field advantage for them. If this crowd gets behind them, they're going to start to amp up a little bit more, and ultimately by the end of the game, they'll be playing their best football, and Josh Allen will have taken over the game. So that's how I think this game will flow. The Broncos will look good early, prove that they're a solid 7 seed, a worthy opponent for the first couple of minutes, and then towards the end of the game, the Bills will take over as usual. So that's what I'm going to project. I'm going to say that it's going to be a 38-24 scoreline. I think it's going to come down to, Josh Allen just making a little bit more explosive plays, both with his legs and with his arm, than Bo Nix. And so that's my prediction. But let me know what you think in the comments. Be coming up next, we're transitioning over to the NFC, talking about the interesting Packers-Eagles rematch of that game in Brazil Week 1. It should be a good one. We talk about it right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. To access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our fourth segment of today's show, we're transitioning from talking AFC wildcard matchups to now NFC wildcard matchups, and we'll be talking about perhaps the most intriguing one in terms of these teams' ambitions and prospects for the Super Bowl, the Packers and the Eagles, a rematch of that thrilling Week 1 encounter down in Brazil. Really kicked the NFL season off right, and now these two teams coming into this game seem pretty similar, not just in terms of play style, but also in terms of injury status. Because remember, in that Week 1 game, Jordan Love did sustain an injury, and in Week 18, he sustained a similar injury that could see him very limited in this game. I think he'll be playing in this one, but maybe he's going to be around a little bit under 85% rather than 100% for this one. But in terms of the Eagles quarterback, Jalen Hurts, he's also coming out of concussion protocol and just practiced for the first time today. So as you can see, two quarterbacks coming in just as banged up as, say, Week 1 encounter. But ultimately, I do think this game is going to be a little bit like what we saw last night with Notre Dame and Penn State at the college level, because both of these teams are very good defensively, and both of these teams love running the football, most importantly. But without further ado, let's get into this game and breaking it down, because I do think that ultimately the Eagles are the better team, but the Packers also have ways to combat what the Eagles can do best as well. And so, looking at it from the Packers' perspective, I do think that the loss of Christian Watson is a little bit bigger than people realize, because even though I do think their formula in this game is going to be running the football with Josh Jacobs, I do think that at some point you're going to have an explosive play make the difference, and having Christian Watson would have really helped in that regard. So not having him for potentially the rest of the postseason as well is a huge detriment to their offense. But ultimately, I do think that Jordan Love is going to trust his backfield partner and also the versatility of his myriad number of receivers he already has to really try and make a go of it. And so I think that if you're the Packers, you're going to want to match the Eagles' game plan, because I think the Eagles are thinking similarly to what the Packers are thinking. Run the football, and with your defense, force turnovers. One of the best defenses in terms of generating takeaways in the league. I believe they led the league in takeaways as well. But ultimately, I think the Packers' offense is going to have to be the X factor here, and in turn, Josh Jacobs will have to be the best player on the football field, and I think he will, because he's been waiting for this moment his entire NFL career. Only one singular postseason game with the Raiders in his time there, and now he's really hungry to get into the postseason with the Packers, really make a name for himself. As Hippie J into the comments, let's go Buckeyes, Jeremiah Smith. Good luck to you as well. I'm rooting for Texas personally, but Jeremiah Smith is an incredible player. unlike anything our secondary has seen before. It's going to be a good one. Good luck to you, man. But I have to stick with my Hornets, even though I did pick Ohio State in my segment. I'm going to be rooting for them heavily, but ultimately, good luck to you. It's going to be a battle, and I really think it's going to be one of the best CFP playoff games we've seen in recent memory. But getting back into the Packers-Eagles game here, like I said, Josh Jacobs. I think that he's going to be a very important factor in this game. He's been really amping it up these past couple of games. I believe he's had more or around 100 yards in all 3 of these games. As Hippie J also says, CJ Stroud. I think that he's recalling all these legendary Ohio State legends to kind of rattle me a little bit, but I do think that ultimately it's going to come down to that matchup, right? The receivers versus the secondary. And I think that will win or lose the game for either of these teams, and I respect both of these quarterbacks heavily, and so I think as well, as he also thanks me for having a great stream. But ultimately, getting back into the Packers-Eagles game, I think that what people don't realize about this Packers offense is that I don't necessarily think Matt LaFleur wants Jordan Love to be the answer here. I think that he knows this team needs balance, and I think that even without Christian Watson, which already eliminates a huge part of your passing attack, you're going to head into this postseason saying we got to run the ball, even though Jordan Love has been playing some of his best football since the midway point of the season. But then, on the Eagles side of things, let's look at how the Jalen Hurts injury might impact how they play. As Hippie Chase says, Buckeyes crush Texas with 20 points. I think it's going to be a lot closer than that. I do think that you're underestimating a little bit of what Texas can do offensively, but they do have to play a more complete game than they have played in these playoffs. But I do think that either way, I think one of these things could happen. Either it's going to be a close game or it's going to be a blow, but I still have Ohio State win myself. But that does not mean that my boys will not be able to show up. It's in Texas. Hopefully there's a good home crowd there, good atmosphere there as well. So ultimately I do think it will be a good one. Now, hopefully we can talk a little bit more about the Packers-Eagles game as well, because I do think that Jalen Hurts' injury might not be as impactful as people think, but still could affect this Eagles passing attack, which already is one of the worst aspects of their offense here. And I do think that ultimately they're going to come into this team, as Tony Vlogs also is repping Ohio State tonight. I guess I'm kind of against the gallery here. I guess I'm against the audience a little bit here. A lot of you guys rooting for Ohio State, but it's been like this my entire life, right? I feel like Texas has always been underestimated, has always been the underdog, and hopefully we get the right to say we're back finally by beating you guys and going to Notre Dame, but ultimately you are the better team, and I have to acknowledge that with all your talent, you've truly built a juggernaut over there, and it might show up on the field tonight, but I do hope it's as good a game as what we got last night as well. But thank you for all these Ohio State comments, even though I feel like I'm being attacked here, to be honest with you, but I appreciate your love for your Buckeyes, because I love the Longhorns just as much as you probably love your Ohio State Buckeyes. But let us continue with this Packers-Eagles segment as well, because I do want to talk some MFL as well, as much as you guys are passionate about college football. Looking again at the Eagles style of play, it's going to be similar to the Packers, like I said, but I do think that Jalen Hurts does have more versatility in his receiving core, should, he have to pass more often than not to make the big plays downfield, and that could be the ultimate difference here. But I will say this about the Packers defense. I have never truly liked this defense, even though it has been one of the league's best, just because they seem to be a little bit too over-reliant on generating takeaways. But if you're good at that, and no matter where you are in the field, you continue to take the football away from opposing teams, that really plays into helping get your offense on track more than anything. Because if you, say, are getting beat up a little bit, the team is driving on you and you force a big turnover, that really slows down the rhythm of this game and gets your offense amped up. Because if your defense is producing for you, you want to go out in the field and fight for them too. And I think that will play into the Packers' hands should Jalen Hurts be a little bit shaky in this one. And so that's another aspect. If Jalen Hurts has to drop back to pass, there be some mistakes in his game in this one as well. Because I do think that, yes, Saquon's an ultimate security blanket, right? He is the guy who was only one of the 9th backs to rush for over 2,000 yards, and he really is a special talent. But ultimately, you're not going to win football games by just running the football. As Tony Vlock says, Ohio State score predictions, who's going to win? Ohio State 31, Texas 22. At least you're closer than what my friend Hippie J says. But I do think that's around where I see this game going should Ohio State win, because I do think that Ohio State's offense will look good throughout this game, but I don't necessarily think they'll look as spectacular as they have over these past 2 games. I do think it will be a battle, even though Texas was kind of running ragged in that game against Arizona State there in overtime, and Andrew Makuba had to come up with a lucky play ultimately to win that one. So I do think that I respect your score a little bit more than Hippie J's, but I do hope, like I said, as always, that this game is another CFP classic. But in conclusion, in terms of my thoughts for the Packers-Eagles game, I do think that in terms of my predictions, the Eagles will ultimately look like the better team, the more prepared team, just because they have those 2 receivers in A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith that the Packers don't. And so that's why I have to err on the side of favoritism here. Because while I do think the Packers could be a viable team, should they lean on Josh Jacobs and have him be their best player, have him go out and dominate, I do think that this Eagles defense has been underestimated in not just the pass but the run. I do think the guys up front have been doing an excellent job. Kudos to free agent addition Zach Bond, one of the most incredible defensive players in all of the NFL this season. And so he's going to be kind of challenged here. And so I do think that ultimately on both sides of the football, the Eagles just have a little bit more. So I'm going to say the Eagles win this one. I think it's going to be a bit of a shootout. I'm going to give my flowers to what Green Bay has offensively and what their defense can do to alter the look of this game. But I do think that the Eagles will pull away, potentially on like a last-minute field goal or a last-minute touchdown, whether it be through Saquon or Jalen Hurts through the air. They win this one 34-31. I do think it will be a classic NFL wildcard game, much like I hope this Ohio State game that you're all clamoring about in the comments will be as well. But coming up to conclude today's show is another underrated wildcard matchup here, perhaps the best of the weekend. The Commanders taking on the Bucs, 5-4 in the NFC. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it. Hello everyone and welcome back into our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for that final segment, we'll be talking about our final, well not necessarily final because we still have on Monday again to talk about between the Vikings and Rams, but perhaps the most exciting, thrilling matchup of this wildcard weekend here between the Commanders and the Bucs. Two teams that are going highly underrated this postseason, if you ask me, with two prolific offenses, and Jaden Daniels and Baker Mayfield is the QB matchup we didn't know we needed in this postseason. This is also a rematch of a Week 1 encounter where Jaden Daniels has looked a little bit more mortal than what he looked throughout the rest of the season, but ultimately I do think that this one is going to be yet another high-scoring affair in the the Super Wildcard weekend. Without further ado, let's jump right into both of these teams, starting off with the home team in Tampa Bay. This Tampa Bay team really amped it up in the stretch, didn't they? They looked like they were potentially going to lose the NFC South due to that head-to-head tiebreaker against Atlanta. Still cannot believe that this team lost to Kirk Cousins twice in this season, but that just goes to show the volatility of the NFC South. But ultimately, Baker Mayfield, let's talk about him as well. One of potentially only 3 quarterbacks, I believe, this decade to throw for 40 touchdowns or more in a season. This offense averaged the 4th most points in the league this season, 28.6 points, 3rd most in franchise history for that matter, and they had the legendary Tom Brady as their quarterback, and they had some pretty decent ones at the start of their franchise career. So ultimately, a pretty impressive achievement offensively for the Bucs, and seemingly firing on all cylinders. But I do think that where the concerns come in for the Bucs is that defense. A little bit banged up, especially in the secondary over the past couple of weeks. Had to add a lot of guys off of the IR and trying and finding those free agent acquisitions that potentially help them in the offseason. But ultimately, it was to no avail. They still allowed the 4th most passing yards in the league, 249.3. And that's not necessarily news you want to hear if you're the Bucs defense and you're going to be facing a guy in Jaden Daniels who really likes picking defenses apart. And he's not the same guy you faced in week 1. Remember that. Let's talk about Jaden Daniels on the other side of things for Washington. Most impressive rookie season of all time, probably. And he had to follow up C.J. Stroud's last season. And I feel like Jaden Daniels, yes, didn't have the touchdown production that C.J. Stroud had last season through the air, but his dual threat ability and his ability to buy into Cliff Kingsbury's offense, this more college-style setting that really appeals to him a little bit more than other pro-style offenses that potentially he could have seen himself in. But ultimately, really impressive, most importantly, efficient rookie season here for the Commanders. And I really think that's what's going to help them in this game, is that Jaden Daniels is unflappable, most importantly, out of all the rookie quarterbacks, especially the ones in the postseason, and we already talked about Bo Nix, is most willing to take what the defense gives him. He has one of the better receiving cores that a rookie quarterback could have in a situation like this. He has Terry McLaurin, one of the most underrated wide receivers in the NFL right now, and he's really elevated these other guys in the system. Olamide Zaccheaus is a 5'8" undrafted free agent who's bounced around the league a lot and has really become one of these nice little role-playing pieces for the Commanders these past couple of weeks heading into the postseason. And then let's talk about that backfield. I really like this backfield, one of the better ones heading into this postseason, and the balance of it. When Austin Eckler was healthy this season, really liked his north-south ability, but then Brian Robinson Jr. I really like his power and his speed and how they combine to really stymie defenses up front. And I feel like that's one way that the Commanders can really cause some noise here should they advance in this game, because they're really disciplined in how they operate both running and passing the football. It's not just, Jaden Daniels running it like we're a college offense where you can slow it down, up the tempo. No, there is structure and scheming to this Commanders offense that has really been brilliant to watch all year. So kudos to Cliff Kingsbury, who at one point was seen as someone who was always known for these offenses that got off to hot starts but petered out towards the end, for sustaining this with a rookie quarterback, no less, and being bold and saying, hey, Jaden Daniels might not be ready for, say, a more pro-style type of offense. Let's put him in something he's a little bit more comfortable running and have him operate at a high, efficient level that ultimately puts points on the board and protects the football for our offense. So kudos to Cliff Kingsbury, most underrated coordinators of the year, in my opinion, offensive or defensive. So that's going to be a major factor in this one. Let's talk about why I think the Bucs still have a slight edge in this matchup here. I do think that one of the big problems people see with Baker Mayfield potentially in this offense is his reliance on Mike Evans. And that has been forced to change a little bit as Mike Evans has dealt with injury this season, as well as Chris Godwin going down for the season as well. And so it made it a little bit more complicated for Baker Mayfield to really develop a rapport with these younger guys, a lot of these rookie guys, Otten and McMillan. But they've really grown into their own as well, and Baker has really started to trust them a lot more than I would have thought after, these injuries in the wide receiving core. So that's one thing to monitor, because I do think in certain situations, say inside the 20-yard line in the red zone for the Bucs offense, he will look to Mike Evans more often than not, and that will really help an opposing defense, especially a Washington Commanders secondary that's really rounding into form. Getting back Marshawn Lattimore for this game especially could help them win that matchup. But I do think that you have to be wary of this Bucs offense in the red zone a little bit more than you think, because while I do think that connection is going to be a potent, impactful one in this game, no matter if they win or lose it, I do think there's more versatility than you have. You also have one of the better running back groups heading into this postseason if you're the Bucs, with Bucky Irving coming to life, Rachaad White really helping you in the receiving game, and Sean Tucker adding valuable short yardage gains as well. And so I do think that in those situations, you could run the football a little bit more. And also, you have a lot more versatility in the pass game than you think. I love what Jalen McMillan has been able to do. I love Cade Otton if the Commanders play a little bit more zone coverage down there than usual. And so that's where I see the Bucs potentially having a problem, but also having the abilities to overcome it a lot more easily than, say, the Commanders in this game. And I also think that another big thing defensively for the Bucs is that I think that if you can stop in the run, which I think is the better aspect of their defense, they have the big man Vita Vea up front to handle that. I think that it can really cause you to hone in, and also getting Jaden Daniels out of the pocket and having a spy on him that follows him around. Because while I'm worried about Terry McLaurin, I want to see these receivers like Zaccheaus, like De'Ami Brown step up in a postseason setting, and I don't think they'll be able to in certain situations. I think that ultimately we'll see Jaden Daniels have to perform a little bit more out of structure than he's used to and what this offensive staff is used to, and so that's where I find trouble and caveats with this Commanders offense. But the ways to counteract it if you're Jaden Daniels are simple. Simply stay the efficient quarterback you've been all season. Stay on schedule on early downs. Really rely on this running game, because this run game, I think, has gotten you this far and has really been the most underrated aspect of your offense and its prolific aspects. I think that if you lean on those guys, chances are good things will happen. You'll stay on schedule. And most importantly, keep the ball out of this prolific Bucs offense's hands for a little bit longer. And so that's where I feel Jaden Daniels has a plan to combat what the Bucs can do in stopping the run, because that's where I think their attention will be focused on. But I do think that ultimately, if you're the Bucs offense, you have a good feeling that now that Baker has realized the depth of this team, no matter how youthful it is, on the offense side of the football, he's going to start to trust them a lot more. And these players are more than capable of lifting up the slack. And I know it's funny to say that these rookie wide receivers are going to be better than what Jaden Daniels has made guys like Zaccheaus and Brown who have actually been in the league. But it is a point that I think will be proven in terms of how this offense is called. And not for nothing, Cliff Kingsbury might have been one of the most underrated offensive coordinators of the year. Liam Cohen might have just been the best for the past 2 years or so, revitalizing Baker Mayfield's career and ultimately getting this offense on schedule no matter what happens to it. So it's going to be a really nice tactical matchup with these two offensive coordinators going at it, not necessarily directly, but in trying to break down two of the worst defenses, in my opinion, in the entire bracket. Because ultimately, I don't necessarily think this game is going to be about turnovers. I think it's going to be more about field position, ball control, and most importantly, if Jaden Daniels looks mortal like he did in week one, way back in week one. Because if anything, I do think that the Commanders are more prone to make mistakes than the Bucs. And so if Jaden Daniels does play efficiently, doesn't necessarily panic, and most importantly is good out of structure, then it might not be a major concern. But it's still in the back of my mind because, like I said, this is his first playoff experience as a rookie. And while we have some kind of blueprint to follow with CJ Stroud last year, what he was able to do to the Browns last year, and then ultimately falling to the Ravens, I feel like in order for him to force this upset, he's going to have to match Baker Mayfield. And Baker Mayfield, in my opinion, yes, also is prone to making mistakes because he has more of a swashbuckling style, but is more willing to make the explosive play downfield. And so that's where I think the Commanders might have to play catch up a little bit if they look a bit more methodical in terms of their offensive approach. And so that's why, in terms of prediction, I'm going to take the Bucs in a high-scoring affair here, 38-34. I just think that Baker Mayfield will be able to make a lot more big plays because of his ambitious approach than Jaden Daniels' methodical one. And this is no indictment of Jaden Daniels because I love an efficient rookie quarterback. It's just that it might not work when you're going up against this red-hot offense. And so, as much as I would love to see an upset here, I have to take the Bucs at home with Baker Mayfield playing like he is against a rookie quarterback. But let me know what you think about this game in the comments below, because it ultimately will be our final one before we preview the Vikings-Rams one Monday. But that will just about do it for the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. I've been your host, Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show network if you haven't done so already. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features when we go live through all of our shows to contribute and interact a little bit more directly. But other than that, see you next week. Enjoy tonight's game. Hopefully, Hook'em Horns will win, despite what the chat has said. But I'm out for this week. Thank you all for tuning in.